Have you ever wondered how much you can actually trust your own mind? Your memories, your perception, your identity, even the way you understand yourself? We like to believe that our minds show us reality exactly as it is. But psychology tells us something much more complicated. Our minds interpret reality. They reconstruct memories. They protect us from painful experiences. And sometimes, they can completely change the way we see ourselves. That's why some movies are more than entertainment. They become psychological experiments. And today, we're going to look at 4 movies that explore 4 disturbing sides of the human mind. Memento, memory. Black Swan, perfectionism and identity. Shutter Island, trauma and denial. And Fight Club, identity fragmentation and alienation. For completely different stories. But underneath them is one common question. What happens when your own mind becomes the thing you can't completely trust? Let's begin. 1. Memento, when memory becomes unreliable. Imagine waking up tomorrow and remembering everything about your life, except what happened yesterday. You meet someone, you have a conversation, you walk away, and minutes later, you can't remember who they were. Now imagine trying to solve a murder under those conditions. That's the psychological nightmare at the center of Christopher Nolan's Memento. The main character, Leonard Shelby, is searching for the person responsible for his wife's death. But Leonard has a severe problem with forming new memories. So he creates a system to compensate. Photographs, notes, and tattoos. He literally writes information onto his own body because he can't depend on his memory. And this creates the first psychological question of our journey. If you can't remember your past, how do you know who you are? Most of us think of memory as a recording. Something happens. Our brain stores it, and later we retrieve it. But human memory is much more complicated. Memory is reconstructive. Every time we remember something, we're essentially reconstructing the event from information stored in our brain. Leonard's problem takes this to an extreme. He can't rely on the normal continuity of memory, so he has to construct his reality from external evidence. A photograph tells him, this happened. A note tells him, trust this person. A tattoo tells him, this is important. But there's a terrifying problem. Leonard doesn't always remember why he created those instructions in the first place. So even the evidence he trusts has to be trusted blindly. And that's what makes Memento so disturbing. Leonard thinks he's searching for the truth, but his condition makes him vulnerable to creating a version of the truth that gives his life meaning. The investigation becomes more than an investigation. It becomes his identity. Without the investigation, what is Leonard supposed to do? This leads to one of the most fascinating ideas in the movie. Maybe Leonard doesn't simply need to find the truth. Maybe he needs a reason to keep going. And that's why Memento isn't just a mystery. It's a psychological story about memory, identity, and the human need for meaning. The movie even makes the audience experience Leonard's confusion by presenting the story in a fragmented way. We're constantly asking, what happened? Who can we trust? What's real? And eventually, we realize that those are exactly the questions Leonard is asking. So Memento gives us our first psychological phenomenon. When memory becomes unreliable, our sense of reality and identity can become unstable with it. But memory isn't the only thing that can distort our reality. Sometimes, it's our obsession with becoming perfect. And that's where our second movie begins. 2. Black Swan. When perfection becomes obsession. What if becoming perfect is exactly what destroys you? Nina Sayers is a talented ballet dancer. She's disciplined, focused, hardworking, and completely obsessed with becoming the best. When she receives the opportunity to perform the lead role in Swan Lake, it should be the greatest moment of her life. But there's a problem. She has to play 2 completely different characters, the innocent white swan and the seductive black swan. And psychologically, that becomes a battle between 2 sides of Nina herself. The controlled side and the impulsive side, the obedient side and the rebellious side, the person she believes she should be, and the person she's afraid she might become. So here's our second psychological question. When does healthy ambition become destructive perfectionism? Wanting to improve isn't necessarily unhealthy. The problem begins when your entire sense of self becomes dependent on your performance. Instead of thinking, I made a mistake, you begin thinking, I am a failure. That's a completely different psychological experience. Nina doesn't simply want to perform well. She needs to be perfect, and the more pressure she experiences, the more her identity becomes connected to that perfection. Her body becomes something to control. Her emotions become something to control. Her sexuality becomes something to control. Even her thoughts become something to control. But the harder she tries to control herself, the more unstable she becomes. And this is where Black Swan becomes psychological horror. Mirrors appear throughout the movie. Nina repeatedly sees versions of herself that seem separate from the person she believes she is. Reality begins to blur with perception. The audience becomes uncertain about what Nina is actually experiencing. And that's important, because the movie isn't simply showing us a dancer trying to win a role. It's showing us someone becoming psychologically consumed by the demand to become someone else. Nina wants to become the perfect Black Swan, but eventually, she begins losing control over her own identity. And that's the paradox. The more desperately she tries to control herself, the less control she seems to have. Black Swan therefore explores perfectionism, identity conflict, performance pressure, and psychological deterioration. It asks us something uncomfortable. What if you spend so much time trying to become the person you think you should be that you forget who you actually are? Memento showed us what happens when memory becomes unreliable. Black Swan shows us what can happen when identity becomes dependent on perfection. But what happens when the truth itself becomes too painful to accept? For that, we have to go to an island. 3. Shutter Island. When the mind hides the truth. What if the truth is so painful that your own mind creates another reality to protect you from it? That's the psychological mystery at the center of Shutter Island. Teddy Daniels arrives at Ashcliff Hospital with his partner, Chuck. They're investigating the disappearance of a patient. But almost immediately, something feels wrong. The doctors seem suspicious. The patients seem to know more than they're saying. Teddy believes there's a conspiracy. Maybe the hospital is performing illegal experiments. Maybe everyone is lying. Maybe there's something hidden on the island. And the more Teddy investigates, the more convinced he becomes. But here's the psychological question. What if Teddy isn't uncovering a conspiracy? What if his mind is protecting him from something much more painful? This is where Shutter Island becomes fascinating. Because Teddy isn't simply investigating an external mystery. He's also avoiding an internal reality. Trauma can profoundly affect the way people process experiences. And one of the psychological mechanisms explored by the movie is denial. Denial isn't simply lying to other people. Sometimes it can involve being unable or unwilling to fully accept an emotionally unbearable reality. Teddy has created another story. He's a federal marshal. He's investigating a case. He's searching for answers. He has someone else to blame. He has something to fight. That story gives him purpose. And purpose can be psychologically powerful. Because if Teddy accepts the truth, the entire world he's constructed collapses. That's why the mystery matters. It's not just about solving a case. It's about protecting an identity. The audience experiences the story through Teddy's perspective. We become suspicious with him. We see clues through his eyes. We start believing his theory. And then, the movie forces us to question everything. What if the person we're following isn't an unreliable detective, but an unreliable narrator of his own life? That's the disturbing idea behind Shutter Island. Sometimes the mind doesn't simply hide information. It can construct an entirely different explanation for reality. And this gives us another psychological lesson. People don't always avoid painful truths because they don't know the truth. Sometimes the truth is too painful for them to accept. And that's why Teddy's story is so tragic. He's not simply running away from the hospital. He's running away from himself. But there's one final psychological phenomenon we need to explore. Because what happens when someone doesn't just reject part of reality, but creates another version of themselves? That's where Fight Club takes us. 4. Fight Club. When you can't accept who you are. What if the person you hate is actually a part of yourself? The narrator in Fight Club appears to have everything society tells him he should want. A job, an apartment, possessions, a comfortable life. But internally, he feels completely empty. He's disconnected from his own existence. He works, he consumes, he sleeps, and repeats the same cycle. Then Tyler Durden appears. Confident, charismatic, aggressive, fearless, free. Everything the narrator believes he isn't. And that's where our final psychological question appears. What happens when the identity you show the world becomes completely disconnected from the person you want to be? The narrator suppresses his anger, his frustration, his aggression, his dissatisfaction. Tyler represents the opposite. He doesn't suppress anything. He embraces everything the narrator has rejected. And that's why Tyler is psychologically fascinating. He can be interpreted as an extreme representation of the narrator's suppressed desires and frustrations. The narrator wants freedom. Tyler gives him freedom. The narrator hates conformity. Tyler rejects conformity. The narrator feels powerless. Tyler feels completely powerful. But there's a problem. The thing that initially feels like liberation eventually becomes destructive, and the conflict becomes internal. The narrator doesn't simply have to fight society. He has to confront the part of himself he has refused to acknowledge. Fight Club therefore explores alienation, identity, masculinity, consumerism, and dissociative themes. But there's an important distinction. The movie should not be treated as a scientifically accurate representation of dissociative identity disorder. It's a fictional psychological construction, and that's precisely why it's interesting. Tyler functions as a dramatic representation of a divided identity. The narrator wants to become someone else because he can't accept who he currently is. And that's the tragedy. He thinks Tyler will set him free. But Tyler becomes another form of imprisonment. Because escaping yourself doesn't necessarily mean you're free. Sometimes, you simply run deeper into yourself. And that brings us to the end of part 1. Conclusion. 4 movies, 1 psychological idea. So what do Memento, Black Swan, Shutter Island, and Fight Club have in common? On the surface, almost nothing. One is about memory. One is about ballet. One is a psychological mystery. And one is about underground fighting. But underneath the stories, they're all asking the same question. What happens when a human mind becomes unreliable? In Memento, memory becomes unreliable. Leonard can't trust his ability to remember. In Black Swan, perfection becomes destructive. Nina can't separate her identity from her performance. In Shutter Island, trauma makes reality unbearable. Teddy creates another explanation to protect himself from the truth. And in Fight Club, identity becomes fragmented. The narrator creates another version of himself to escape the life he hates. For movies, for psychological phenomena, but one common idea. We don't experience reality exactly as it is. We experience reality through our memories, our emotions, our fears, our beliefs, our identity. And sometimes, those things can distort the world around us. That's what makes psychological movies so fascinating. They don't simply ask, what happened? They ask, why does this person see the world this way? And maybe that's the most disturbing thing about psychology. You don't need a monster to create a horror story. Sometimes, all you need is a human mind trying desperately to protect itself. If you enjoyed this psychological breakdown, subscribe to the channel. This is only part 1. In the next part, we'll explore more movies where trauma, obsession, loneliness, manipulation, and identity completely change the way characters see themselves and the world around them. Until then, remember, the most dangerous place in any movie isn't always the outside world. Sometimes, it's inside the mind.